Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we even get into it today, let's just take a second to give a shout out to the authors for the study we're about to dive into, because their work on free trade zones in the Dominican Republic actually won the research award from the Public Finance Research Incentive Program 2019 by the Ministry of Finance of the Dominican Republic.
Oh, wow.
So that's a big deal. We know we're dealing with some seriously impressive analysis here.
Absolutely. It is, yeah. This is a really in-depth look at a system that's really shaped the Dominican economy. We're talking free trade zones or FTZs, those areas with those special tax incentives designed to attract businesses. The big question is, do they actually work? What's the reality?
Right, and you provided us with this incredibly detailed cost-benefit analysis, and we're going to unpack all of it together right here. But this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about real-world stuff, jobs, wages, and how these zones impact the entire Dominican economy.
And that impact is huge. Free trade zones have become a major part of the Dominican economy, contributing around 3.3% of the country's GDP. To get a sense of that, imagine the resources to build several new hospitals or schools every year. It's a substantial contribution.
Wow, so they've gone from practically nothing to a core part of the economy. That's a pretty dramatic shift. When did this all begin?
So the very first free trade zone was established way back in 1969 in La Romana. A foreign company, Gulf and Western Americas Corporations, set it up. At the time, it was mainly focused on sugar production, but it marked the start of a really big economic transformation.
Okay, so how did it go from one sugar-focused operation to this huge system driving the economy? What happened in those initial years?
A couple of key things. The Dominican Republic was moving towards a model of import substitution, basically, focusing on making goods domestically instead of relying on imports. This, combined with the Industrial Incentive and Protection Law of 1968, created a really good environment for industry to grow.
So they were setting the stage for these free trade zones to take off.
Exactly. And then in the late 1980s, a whole bunch of things happened all at once, including like a standby agreement with the International Monetary Fund. And this really accelerated the growth of these zones. They became a cornerstone of the country's export strategy.
Good, that makes sense. Now, when most people hear free trade zone, they probably picture giant factories producing things for export. Is that still the main picture in the Dominican Republic?
Actually, it's more diverse than you might think. While other manufacturing is still the biggest sector when you just look at the number of companies, there's been a noticeable shift in recent years. So from like 2008 to 2018, we saw a big rise in businesses focused on commerce, real estate, especially industrial parks, and even telecommunications.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just those traditional manufacturing plants anymore.
Yeah.
This is more complex than I first imagined.
It is. And where these zones are located is changing too. While Santiago and Santo Domingo are still the major centers, other provinces are starting to see more activity in their free trade zones.
That makes me wonder, for someone setting up a business in the Dominican Republic today, would being in a free trade zone be a major factor in their decision? What do you think?
It's a big consideration for a lot of businesses, particularly those focused on export. Now let's change gears for a bit and talk about jobs, because that's a big piece of this puzzle. Between 2008 and 2018, the total number of jobs in free trade zones rose dramatically by over 42%.
Wow.
But here's where it gets interesting. The average number of employees per company actually went down in that same period.
Wait, so the total number of jobs went up, but the number of people at each company went down. How does that work? Are they just producing more with less people?
You got it. It suggests that companies are becoming more capital intensive, meaning they're putting more money into things like machinery and technology.
Makes sense.
Think of it like if a factory used to rely on 100 workers to put a product together manually, now they might invest in automated robots that can do the same job with just 50 workers.
Oh, I see.
So they produce twice as much, but with fewer employees.
That's really interesting. Fewer employees per company, but more output overall. So what does this mean for wages in these zones? Are people making more or less?
That's a great question, and the data shows a shift in the wage distribution towards higher salaries.
Right.
This is probably due to a few things, including a growing demand for specialized skills to operate more advanced equipment.
So it seems this shift to automation and more specialized skills is having a good impact on wages, which is good news for workers in these zones. But it also makes me think, if companies are making more with fewer workers, does that affect the total number of jobs available?
That's a really important point, and while it seems counterintuitive, the data actually shows that even as companies become more capital intensive, the overall number of jobs in these free trade zones continues to grow. And this is probably because the FTZ system as a whole is expanding. More companies are setting up in these zones, so there are more jobs, even if individual companies have fewer people.
So it's a kind of balancing act. More automation might mean fewer jobs at each company, but the system's expansion makes enough new jobs to make up for that.
Exactly. But we can't just look at the number of jobs. The quality of those jobs is important too. Are they good jobs? Are the working conditions fair? Those are essential things to think about when we're evaluating the impact of these free trade zones.
For sure, creating jobs shouldn't mean sacrificing worker well-being.
Yeah.
So this whole conversation about jobs and wages leads to a really important question. Are these free trade zones good for the Dominican Republic as a whole? We've talked about the growth, the new jobs, but what about the costs?
Yeah, we need to look at both sides. And that's where the cost-benefit analysis we're talking about comes in. It looks at not just the direct effects of FTZs, things like wages paid and profits made, but also those ripple effects we mentioned before.
You talk about those indirect and induced economic benefits, right? Like when FTZ companies buy things from local businesses or their employees spend their wages in the local economy.
Right? Those things can create a multiplier effect, boosting other sectors and creating economic activity that goes way beyond the free trade zones themselves. So the study adds up all the good stuff and compares it to the costs, which include things like tax breaks and import duty exemptions that the government gives to companies in these zones.
Got it. So it's a pretty complex calculation with all these different things to consider. So what does it tell us? Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
This is where it gets interesting. The study used a method based on national accounting principles, so they break things down company by company. And what they found is that overall, when you look at the big picture, the benefits are bigger than the costs FTZs are creating a net positive effect for the Dominican economy.
That's great. So it seems like these zones are a good thing for the Dominican Republic, but I feel like there's a but coming.
You know me too well. There's always a but. In economics, while the overall picture is positive, the analysis also found some differences at the company level. Some companies are doing really well, creating a lot more value than the cost of the incentives they receive. But there are also companies where the costs are higher than the benefits they're producing.
Hold on. So some companies are basically getting a free ride. That doesn't seem fair at all.
It's a valid point, and it highlights the importance of looking not just at the big picture, but also at how each company is performing within the system. It makes us ask some tough questions about fairness and efficiency.
Okay, so if you were advising the Dominican government on how to deal with this, what would you recommend? How do they figure out which companies aren't doing their part and make sure everyone is contributing fairly?
Well, the first step is using the data from this cost-benefit analysis to really dig in and understand what's making some companies do better than others. Why are some thriving while others are falling behind? Are there specific things they're doing or characteristics that help them succeed in the FTZ system?
So it's about using the data to get a more detailed picture of what's working and what's not, and then using that to make better policy decisions.
That's it. For example, if the analysis shows that certain sectors are always doing better than others, the government could try to attract more businesses in those high-performing sectors, or they could look at ways to help the companies in the sectors that are lagging behind.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, they could be more strategic with how they give out incentives and resources.
Exactly. And they could also think about setting specific goals that companies have to meet to qualify for incentives. Like maybe companies would have to create a certain number of jobs, use a certain amount of local materials, or invest in research and development to get tax breaks or other benefits.
That makes sense. It's about rewarding companies for actually helping the Dominican economy, not just for setting up shop in a free trade zone.
Right. And this brings us back to that term you mentioned earlier, gasto tributario, which means tax expenditure. It's about the cost of those tax breaks and exemptions that the government is giving out.
Right, we talked about those costs before. How big are they, and are there ways to manage them without scaring away investors?
Well, the study found that the gasto tributario connected to FTZs has been going up, especially those related to imports in 2018. These costs were equal to 1.1% of the Dominican Republic's GDP. That's a significant chunk of government money that could be used for other important things like education, healthcare, or infrastructure.
It's a lot of money. So it's really important to make sure that money is being used well and effectively. What are some other things the government could try?
One idea is to move away from giving everyone the same exemptions and instead create more targeted incentives, like we talked about before. Instead of giving everyone a discount, they could offer tax breaks only to companies that meet certain conditions, like investing in R&D, creating high-paying jobs, or using a certain percentage of local inputs.
So it's about being more careful with those incentives and rewarding companies for specific actions that benefit the Dominican economy.
Precisely. And they could also explore other ways to attract investment, like making regulations simpler and cutting down on bureaucratic obstacles. This could make the Dominican Republic more attractive to businesses without having to give up so much tax revenue.
So it's not always about giving money away. It's about creating a good environment for business that encourages companies to invest and grow.
Absolutely. And remember, those indirect and induced economic contributions we talked about are also important. If a company creates jobs and helps local businesses, those positive effects benefit the Dominican economy, even if the company itself isn't paying a lot in taxes.
It sounds like there's a delicate balance to find. We want to encourage investment and create jobs, but we also need to make sure the benefits are greater than the costs and that everyone is contributing their fair share. It's a complicated issue with a lot of moving parts.
You're exactly right, and it reminds us that economic policy isn't just about numbers, it's about people. The choices we make about things like free trade zones have real impacts on the lives of Dominicans. They can create jobs, raise wages, and boost economic growth, but we have to make sure those benefits are shared widely and that we're not accidentally creating a system that only helps a small group of people at the expense of everyone else.
That's an important point. So for our listeners who are following along and thinking, this is all very interesting, but what does it mean for me? How does this affect my everyday life? What would you say?
I think it's important to remember that even economic policies that seem kind of abstract, like free trade zones, actually have a real impact on our lives. The clothes we wear, the electronics we use, the food we eat. A lot of these products are made in FTZs all over the world, including in the Dominican Republic. And the way these zones are set up and regulated can affect how much these things cost, how good they are, and whether we can even get them.
So when we're buying things, are we indirectly part of this global system?
Exactly. And as citizens, we have a say in the policies that control these systems. By understanding how they work and talking about them in an informed way, we can push for policies that promote fairness, sustainability, and prosperity for everyone.
That's a great reminder that we all have a part to play in creating a more just and fair economic future.
Absolutely.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how complicated free trade zones are and how they affect the Dominican economy.
Me too. It's been great talking about this with you.
And for our listeners, we'll leave you with something to think about. Imagine you're advising the Dominican government on how to make their free trade zone system the best it can be. What changes would you suggest to make sure it benefits the whole country, not just a select few?
It's a tough but really important question to think about. The choices we make about economic policies have big consequences.
Right.
And by having these conversations and asking these tough questions, we can work towards a more prosperous and equitable future for everyone.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Dominican Republic free trade zones. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions. It's pretty amazing how something like a free trade zone can be connected to so many different parts of life of the Dominican Republic and even affect us as consumers in other countries.
Yeah, it really shows you how interconnected the global economy is.
Totally. But let's zoom back in on the Dominican Republic for a minute. We've looked at the history, the growth, all the jobs it's created, those ripple effects, the costs, the benefits. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it all goes back to that fundamental question, are free trade zones in the Dominican Republic actually working?
Exactly. After all this discussion, where do we stand on that question?
Well, based on what we've talked about, it seems like the answer is a cautious yes. When you look at the big picture, the benefits do seem to be bigger than the costs again. Free trade zones have definitely played a big part in how the Dominican Republic's economy has developed.
And I'm kind of expecting but here it's not a perfect system, right?
You're right. There's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to making sure that every company in the free trade zone system is really contributing fairly and not just taking advantage of tax breaks without creating enough positive impact.
So how can the Dominican government make sure these zones are working as well as they can? We've talked about targeted incentives and streamlining regulations. What else can they do?
One important thing they could focus on is making their monitoring and evaluation processes stronger. If they can track how each company in the FTZ system is doing more closely, They'll be able to spot the ones that aren't doing well and maybe change how they give out incentives based on that.
So it's about holding companies accountable and making sure they're doing what they said they would.
Exactly. And they can also use that data to make better policy decisions in the future. Are some sectors always doing better than others? Are certain types of incentives more effective at attracting investment and creating those positive ripple effects? This kind of analysis can help the government fine-tune the system and make it work even better for the Dominican economy.
It's kind of like fine-tuning a machine, always collecting data and making adjustments to get the best performance.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, the goal is to create a system that benefits the whole country, not just a few companies.
So what does all this mean for the average person in the Dominican Republic? How does this actually affect their lives?
Well, for one thing, FTZs have created a lot of jobs, hundreds of thousands. And as we said, those jobs are paying more and more, which means more Dominicans have more money to spend, and that spending helps the local economy grow.
Right, it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And those ripple effects we talked about, those indirect and induced contributions, they create jobs and boost the economy in other areas too, beyond just the FTZs themselves. Plus, FTZs attract investment from other countries, which can bring in new technologies and knowledge, helping to make the Dominican economy more diverse and competitive on a global scale.
So these zones have a lot of potential to help the country grow in the long run.
Absolutely. But as we've discussed, it all comes down to making smart decisions about policy, making sure everyone benefits, and always evaluating and tweaking the system to make it as effective as possible.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about how free trade zones work and how they affect the Dominican Republic's economy.
Me too. It's been great exploring this with you.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on free trade zones and their role in the global economy. Remember, even economic policies that seem far removed from our daily lives can actually have a real impact.
It's a good reminder to stay curious, keep learning, and be part of meaningful discussions about the things that shape our world.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring.